The F-22 Raptors maintained their formation at 38,000 feet, their angular silhouettes cutting through the morning sky like predatory birds. Major Jake "Viper" Morrison adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his radar display for the third time in 2 minutes. Something was wrong. The target they'd been tracking for the past 40 minutes had vanished from all conventional detection systems, yet visual confirmation suggested she was still there, a ghost dancing between the clouds. Control, this is Viper 1. Target is maintaining heading 270, but we're getting intermittent radar returns. Request permission to close distance. His voice carried the practiced calm of a pilot with 12 years of flight time, but his grip on the stick betrayed his unease. Negative, Viper 1. Maintain current separation. Target is cleared for unrestricted flight operations in that corridor. The controller's response crackled through the encrypted channel, but Morrison caught something in the tone, a hesitation that suggested even ground control didn't fully understand what they were observing. Through his helmet-mounted display, Morrison watched the aircraft ahead execute a climbing turn that should have been impossible for anything other than a fifth-generation fighter. The problem was, according to their intelligence briefing, the pilot flying that machine was supposed to be retired. Colonel Kestrel Ghost Nakamura had officially hung up her wings 18 months ago after what the Pentagon quietly called the Kandahar incident. Morrison's wingman, Captain Lisa "Razor" Rodriguez, maintained radio silence, but he could see her F-22 drifting slightly closer to get a better look at their quarry. The aircraft they were shadowing appeared to be a modified F-16 Fighting Falcon, but its flight characteristics suggested modifications that shouldn't exist, at least not in any configuration Morrison had ever seen in his classified briefings. Viper 2, you copying this? Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert their target to their presence, despite the fact that any competent pilot would have detected their radar signatures miles ago. Copy, Viper 1. That's not flying like any 16 I've ever seen. Rodriguez's response carried an edge of professional curiosity mixed with something approaching respect. She'd heard the stories about Ghost Nakamura, the way they all had, whispered conversations in ready rooms about a pilot who could make an aircraft dance like it was alive. The morning sun painted the clouds below them in shades of gold and amber, creating a canvas against which their aerial ballet played out. Morrison had expected this to be a routine intercept mission, possibly even a training exercise designed to test their response times. Instead, he found himself watching a master class in aerodynamics from a pilot who officially didn't exist in the active duty roster anymore. Control, we need clarification on the rules of engagement for this intercept, Morrison transmitted, his eyes never leaving the aircraft ahead that continued to fly as if gravity was merely a suggestion rather than an absolute law. The silence that followed his transmission stretched longer than any pilot was comfortable with. In that void, Morrison began to understand that this mission was far more complex than anyone had briefed them. The woman flying ahead of them wasn't just a target to be tracked. She was a legend returning to the sky, and they were about to discover why some pilots become myths while others simply fade into military history. Rodriguez's F-22 suddenly banked hard left, breaking formation without authorization. Morrison's head snapped toward her aircraft, watching as she executed a series of maneuvers that mirrored exactly what their target was doing. For a moment, it looked like an elaborate aerial dance, two aircraft moving in perfect synchronization, despite being separated by nearly a mile of empty sky. "Razor, what are you doing?" Morrison's voice carried the sharp edge of command authority, but Rodriguez didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued her unauthorized maneuvers, following some pattern that Morrison couldn't understand but somehow felt was significant. The target aircraft, Ghosts Modified, suddenly executed a climbing spiral that defied every principle of energy management Morrison had learned in his years of fighter pilot training. The Falcon should have bled airspeed catastrophically during such a maneuver, yet it maintained altitude and heading as if powered by something beyond conventional physics. "She's testing us," Rodriguez finally transmitted, her voice carrying a note of realization. "The formation we learned about in advanced tactics, the one they said was theoretical, she's flying the Kandahar formation." Morrison felt his blood run cold. The Kandahar formation was more than theoretical, it was classified beyond his clearance level. He'd heard fragments of the story, pieces of a puzzle that suggested Ghost Nakamura had developed aerial tactics that bordered on the impossible. The official reports were sealed, but the unofficial stories spoke of a single pilot holding off an entire squadron of enemy fighters through maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible. "Control, we need immediate clarification. Is this aircraft friendly or hostile?" Morrison's transmission carried an urgency that he couldn't suppress. The rules of engagement were suddenly unclear, and in the skies above 30,000 feet, unclear rules could prove fatal. "Viper Flight, your target is designated friendly. Observe and report. Do not engage unless directly threatened." The controller's voice had changed, becoming more formal, more careful. Morrison recognized the tone. Someone higher up the chain of command was now listening to every word. Ghost's F-16 suddenly dove, losing altitude with a controlled aggression that suggested purpose rather than evasion. Morrison and Rodriguez followed, their F-22s easily matching the descent rate, but something about the maneuver felt wrong. It wasn't evasion, it was invitation. "She wants us to follow," Rodriguez observed, her tactical instincts sharp as ever. "But the question is whether we're chasing her or being led into something." The afternoon sky stretched endlessly around them, a blue canvas marked only by the contrails of 3 aircraft locked in an aerial pas de trois that none of them fully understood. Morrison checked his fuel gauge and realized they were being drawn further from their designated patrol area with each passing minute. "Viper 1, this is Control. Be advised, your target has clearance for unrestricted maneuvers in the training area designated Oscar 7. The transmission came with coordinates that Morrison recognized, a restricted airspace typically reserved for experimental aircraft testing. As they descended through 25,000 feet, Morrison caught his first clear visual of their target. The F-16 had been modified extensively, with additional fuel tanks, enhanced avionics pods, and what appeared to be experimental thrust vectoring nozzles that explained its impossible maneuverability. But more importantly, he could see the pilot's helmet through the canopy, and for the first time in his career, Morrison felt genuinely outmatched in the air. The woman flying that machine wasn't just another pilot. She was something approaching aerial perfection, and they were about to learn why some call signs become legends. Ghost's aircraft suddenly rolled inverted and pulled into a climb that should have resulted in an immediate stall. Instead, the F-16 hung motionless for a moment before transitioning into a controlled flat spin that somehow converted into forward flight. Morrison had never seen anything like it outside of airshow demonstrations, and even then, such maneuvers were typically performed at much lower altitudes with extensive safety protocols. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered over the radio, forgetting proper communication protocol in her amazement. "How is she doing that?" Morrison found himself wondering the same thing. His F-22 was theoretically superior in every measurable category: thrust-to-weight ratio, avionics, stealth capability, weapons systems. Yet watching Ghost fly her modified Falcon, he felt like a student pilot attempting to keep up with an instructor who had transcended the normal limitations of physics and aircraft performance. "Control, requesting background information on pilot designation Ghost," Morrison transmitted, using her call sign deliberately. If they were going to continue this aerial dance, he needed to understand who he was dealing with. "Negative, Viper 1. Continue observation mission as briefed." The response was immediate and final, but Morrison caught something in the controller's voice, a mixture of respect and wariness that suggested Ghost Nakamura's reputation extended far beyond whatever had happened in Kandahar. The F-16 leveled off at 15,000 feet and began what appeared to be a standard combat air patrol pattern. Morrison and Rodriguez maintained their positions, but something had fundamentally changed in the dynamic between hunter and hunted. They were no longer tracking a target. They were being evaluated by a pilot whose skills had become the stuff of military legend. Viper Flight, be advised your target is beginning an instructional demonstration. Observe and learn. The new voice on the radio belonged to someone with stars on their collar. Morrison could hear the authority that came with flag rank. Suddenly, this mission had become something entirely different from what they'd been briefed to expect. Ghost's F-16 began a series of maneuvers that looked like a textbook demonstration of advanced fighter tactics, except performed with a precision and creativity that Morrison had never encountered. Each maneuver flowed seamlessly into the next, creating a continuous ballet of controlled aggression that was both beautiful and terrifying. Rodriguez's F-22 drifted closer, and Morrison could see her trying to replicate some of Ghost's movements. The Raptor was responding well, but there was something missing, the intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that seemed to guide Ghost's every input. Rodriguez was flying her aircraft. Ghost was dancing with hers. "She's not just flying," Rodriguez observed quietly. "She's thinking 3 moves ahead of her aircraft, like chess in 3 dimensions." Morrison nodded inside his helmet, beginning to understand why Ghost Nakamura had become a legend. It wasn't just her technical skill. It was her ability to see aerial combat as something approaching art rather than simple tactical execution. As the demonstration continued, Morrison found himself studying not just the maneuvers but the philosophy behind them. Each movement seemed to serve multiple purposes, creating options while simultaneously limiting an opponent's choices. It was aerial combat theory made manifest in real time, performed by someone who had clearly pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional fighter-pilot training. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Ghost's F-16 suddenly broke from its demonstration pattern and climbed steeply toward the north. Morrison and Rodriguez followed, but they were no longer observers. They had become participants in something that felt more like a master class than a military intercept mission. "Control, are we cleared to continue pursuit?" Morrison asked, though he already knew the answer. Whatever was happening here had been planned from the beginning, and they were simply playing their assigned roles in a larger scenario. "Affirmative, Viper Flight. Continue to observe and learn. Your target will demonstrate advanced evasion techniques developed for modern threat environments." The controller's voice carried a note of anticipation that suggested even ground control was curious to see what Ghost Nakamura would do next. The F-16 climbed through 30,000 feet and continued ascending, pushing into the thin air where few aircraft could operate effectively. Morrison's F-22 followed easily, its powerful engines designed for high-altitude operations, but he was beginning to understand that altitude wasn't the point of this exercise. Ghost was teaching them something about the 3-dimensional nature of aerial combat, demonstrating how a skilled pilot could use the entire envelope of their aircraft's performance to create tactical advantages. It wasn't about raw performance specifications. It was about understanding the relationship between pilot, machine, and environment in ways that went beyond what any manual could teach. "Viper 1, recommend you pay attention to her energy management," Rodriguez transmitted privately. "She's not just flying fast, she's flying smart. Every maneuver sets up the next one." Morrison watched more carefully, beginning to see the patterns Rodriguez had identified. Ghost wasn't just executing individual maneuvers. She was building a continuous sequence that created opportunities while preserving energy and maintaining tactical positioning. It was aerial combat theory elevated to an art form. As they climbed through 40,000 feet, Morrison realized they were approaching the service ceiling of Ghost's F-16. The modified Falcon shouldn't be able to operate effectively at this altitude, yet it continued climbing with apparent ease. The modifications to her aircraft were clearly more extensive than anything he'd been briefed about. She's using the entire vertical dimension as her tactical space, Morrison observed, beginning to understand the scope of what he was witnessing. Most pilots think in terms of horizontal maneuvering, but she's treating altitude as just another axis of movement. The F-16 suddenly rolled inverted and pulled into a dive that should have resulted in structural failure. Instead, Ghost managed the descent with such precision that her aircraft never exceeded safe G-force limits, despite the extreme nature of the maneuver. Morrison found himself holding his breath as he watched perfection in motion. Control, request permission to attempt replication of observed maneuvers, Rodriguez transmitted, her competitive instincts overriding military protocol. Morrison could hear the challenge in her voice, the desire to test herself against a master. Negative, Viper 2, observe only. Those maneuvers require specific aircraft modifications and extensive training. The controller's response was immediate and firm, but Morrison caught something else in the transmission, concern for their safety. Ghost's F-16 leveled off at 25,000 feet and began what appeared to be a standard figure-8 pattern. But as Morrison watched more carefully, he realized each loop was slightly different, creating variations that would make it impossible for an opponent to predict her next movement. It was chaos theory applied to aerial combat, patterns within patterns that appeared random but followed a deeper logic. She's not just evading, Morrison realized aloud. She's creating a tactical environment that forces her opponents to react rather than act. Every move she makes limits their options while expanding her own. Rodriguez's F-22 attempted to mirror the pattern, but within seconds it became clear that what looked simple was actually incredibly complex. The modified F-16 responded to Ghost's inputs with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity developed over years of flying together. Pilot and aircraft had become a single entity. As the afternoon progressed, Morrison began to understand why Ghost Nakamura had become a legend. It wasn't just her individual skills, it was her ability to see aerial combat as a three-dimensional chess game where every move created multiple consequences. She was operating at a level of tactical sophistication that transcended normal fighter-pilot training. The sun was beginning to paint the western sky in shades of orange and red when Ghost's F-16 suddenly executed a maneuver that Morrison had never seen before. The aircraft seemed to pause in midair, rotating around its center of gravity while maintaining forward momentum. It was physically impossible according to everything Morrison had learned about aerodynamics. Control, are we observing some kind of experimental flight technology? Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine amazement. The maneuver he just witnessed challenged his understanding of what was possible in conventional aircraft. Classified Viper 1. Continue observation. The response was terse, but Morrison recognized the implications. Ghost Nakamura wasn't just flying a modified F-16, she was testing technologies that existed beyond normal military aviation programs. Rodriguez's F-22 hung back, maintaining a respectful distance as they continued to observe. Morrison could sense his wingman's frustration at being unable to replicate what they were seeing, but he was beginning to understand that replication wasn't the point of this exercise. She's not showing off, Rodriguez transmitted quietly. She's teaching us something about the limits of what's possible. Every maneuver is a lesson in applied physics and tactical thinking. Morrison nodded inside his helmet, beginning to see the demonstration in a different light. Ghost wasn't just displaying her skills, She was sharing knowledge that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training program. This was experience distilled into movement, wisdom translated into aerodynamics. The F-16 suddenly dove toward a cloud layer at 18,000 feet, disappearing into the white mass with surgical precision. Morrison and Rodriguez followed, their advanced avionics easily tracking through the reduced visibility, but something about entering Ghost's chosen environment felt like crossing a threshold. Inside the clouds, the normal rules of visual flight were suspended. Morrison relied on his instruments, but he could sense Ghost's presence through small disturbances in the air around them. She was using the cloud cover not as concealment, but as a tactical medium, creating a three-dimensional maze that only she understood. She's using the environment as part of her aircraft, Morrison realized, watching his instruments track subtle pressure changes that indicated Ghost's movements through the cloud layer. The clouds aren't hiding her, they're extending her capabilities. Suddenly, the F-16 burst from the cloud layer directly above them, rolling inverted in a maneuver that positioned her perfectly for what would have been a textbook gun attack in actual combat. Morrison felt his heart rate spike as he realized how completely they had been outmaneuvered in what was supposed to be a simple observation mission. "Viper flight, Ghost has you cold," came a new voice over the radio, calm, professional, with a slight accent that suggested origins in the Pacific Northwest. For the first time, they were hearing directly from the legend herself. Morrison's hands tightened on his controls as he processed the implications of what had just happened. In actual combat, he and Rodriguez would have been dead twice over. The woman flying the modified F-16 had just demonstrated a level of tactical superiority that challenged everything he thought he knew about air-to-air combat. "Roger, Ghost, we copy," Morrison responded, his voice carrying the professional respect that one warrior shows another. "Request permission to debrief with you on today's demonstration." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever. When Ghost finally responded, her voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Permission granted, Viper flight. Follow me home. We have much to discuss." As they formed up behind the F-16 for the flight back to base, Morrison realized that this mission had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. He had started the day as a confident fighter pilot with an impressive service record. He was ending it as a student who had been given a glimpse of mastery that existed far beyond his previous understanding. The late afternoon sun painted their formation in golden light as they descended toward the airfield. Ghost's F-16 led them through a gentle spiral descent that seemed almost ceremonial, as if marking the end of a chapter and the beginning of something new. "Viper 1, control. Be advised, you are cleared for unrestricted debrief with Ghost following landing. Senior leadership requests full tactical assessment of observed capabilities." The transmission carried an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested Morrison and Rodriguez weren't the only ones eager to understand what they had witnessed. As they approached the runway, Morrison caught sight of several vehicles positioned around the flight line, black SUVs with government plates, and a small group of personnel in dress uniforms. Whatever had happened during their mission, it had attracted attention from far up the chain of command. Ghost's F-16 touched down with the precision Morrison had come to expect, her landing flare executed with a smoothness that made the complex aircraft look effortless to fly. As he followed her down to the runway, Morrison realized he was about to meet a living legend, someone whose skills had transcended normal military aviation and entered the realm of myth. The aircraft taxied toward a secluded hangar on the far side of the field, away from normal flight operations. Morrison could see personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency that suggested this arrival had been planned and coordinated at levels far above his security clearance. As his F-22 rolled to a stop, Morrison began running through the mental checklist of everything he had observed during their encounter with Ghost. But even as he cataloged the technical details, he knew that the most important lessons couldn't be captured in any official report. What he had witnessed was artistry applied to aerial combat, a level of skill that transformed flying from mere piloting into something approaching transcendence. The canopy of his F-22 opened with a soft hiss, and Morrison climbed down onto the tarmac. Across the hangar, he could see Ghost Nakamura removing her helmet, revealing a face that carried the calm confidence of someone who had pushed beyond normal human limitations and found something extraordinary on the other side. The late afternoon air carried the familiar sense of jet fuel and hot metal, but there was something different about this moment, a sense of standing at the intersection of legend and reality. Morrison straightened his flight suit and walked toward the woman who had just redefined his understanding of what was possible in the air. As he approached, Ghost turned toward him, and Morrison found himself looking into eyes that held depths of experience he couldn't fathom. This was a pilot who had seen the edge of human capability and had chosen to leap beyond it. The stories he had heard were just shadows of a reality that was far more extraordinary than any legend could capture. "Major Morrison," Ghost said, extending her hand in greeting. "Thank you for the dance. Now let me tell you why it mattered." Morrison shook her hand, feeling the calloused grip of someone who had spent years translating thought into flight. As he looked into her eyes, he realized that his education as a fighter pilot was just beginning. Everything he thought he knew about aerial combat was about to be challenged by someone who had rewritten the rules of engagement in ways that existed beyond any manual or training program. The hangar doors closed behind them with a metallic rumble that seemed to seal them off from the ordinary world outside. Inside this space, Morrison sensed, he was about to learn secrets that would change not just his flying, but his understanding of what human beings could achieve when they refused to accept the limitations that others took for granted. Ghost Nakamura moved toward a table covered with aerial photographs and technical diagrams, her movements carrying the same precision and purpose that had characterized her flying. Morrison followed, knowing that he was about to receive an education that no amount of formal training could provide. "The Kandahar Formation," Ghost began, her voice carrying the weight of memory and hard-won wisdom, "was born from necessity. When you're outnumbered 12-1 and conventional tactics mean certain death, you discover capabilities you never knew existed." Morrison listened intently as the legend began to speak, knowing that he was about to hear the real story behind the myths, the human truth that lay beneath the impossible aerial displays he had witnessed. The afternoon light streaming through the hangar windows painted everything in golden hues, as if marking this moment as something that would be remembered long after the tactical details had faded into history.